The year is 2004. When Lineage II, the chaotic chronicle was released, it entered a genre that was still discovering its identity. Online worlds already existed, but few offered the scale, ambition, or freedom that Lineage II brought to the table. Large-scale PvP, castle sieges, a player-driven economy, and a class system built around long-term commitment rather than short-term experimentation all helped shape an experience unlike anything else at the time. Chronicle 1 presented a world that was beautiful, yet unforgiving, and remarkably indifferent to the player's success. It offered few conveniences, almost no hand-holding, and little reassurance that the road ahead would be an easy one. Every achievement had to be earned. Every mistake carried consequences. This is the first in a series of videos dedicated to preserving that world. To keep these videos clear, consistent, and easy to follow, I'll be using an AI-generated voice for the narration. This allows me to focus on the research, writing, and historical accuracy while ensuring that every piece of information is presented as clearly as possible. I hope you enjoy the series. Everything presented throughout this series is based primarily on official material and preserved archival resources. The first of those is LegacyLineage2.com, a remarkable archive that preserves the original Lineage 2 website and its updates from Chronicle 1 onward. If you're interested in the history of the game, I highly recommend visiting it. The second is the Prima official game guide from 2004. Spanning nearly 400 pages, it contains an extraordinary amount of Chronicle 1 information, from skills and mechanics to item statistics, prices, and much more. It's one of the most valuable historical resources available, and one I still find myself opening on a regular basis simply because I enjoy reading it. If you're curious, it's also available online as a PDF. I also relied on lineage2wiki.org, which preserves information covering the early chronicles all the way through High 5, including many mechanics that originated during the Chronicle 1 era. Finally, I'd like to thank FocusD for kindly allowing me to use information and footage from his YouTube channel. His videos are in Russian, which I unfortunately don't speak, but modern translation tools made it possible to understand and verify much of the information he presents. If you're interested in the history of Lineage 2, I highly recommend checking out his work. Now, before we move on, there's one important thing to understand about Chronicle 1. Progression took time. Reaching the higher levels wasn't something players expected to accomplish in a matter of days. Equipment was difficult to obtain, leveling demanded patience, and because of that, most players committed themselves to a single class instead of creating new characters every few weeks. Choosing a class meant choosing its entire journey. Another detail that's often forgotten today is that many classes didn't truly come into their own until level 40, or in some cases, level 49. In many ways, what players considered the endgame began around the early 40s. With top D grade or C grade equipment, areas like Dragon Valley and the Cemetery became realistic hunting grounds, while castle sieges started to feel accessible for a much wider range of players. It was around this point that every class finally began to reveal its true identity. I've chosen to call this section the limitations of Chronicle 1. The first of these, and perhaps one of the defining characteristics of Chronicle 1, was the complete absence of special abilities on weapons. Today, when someone mentions an interlude mage weapon, many players immediately think of a homunculus sword with acumen. In Chronicle 1, that simply wasn't a thing. As you can see on the screen, the game offered a much wider variety of weapons with different models and different magic attack values. Many of them would eventually disappear from regular use, not because they were weak, but because later Chronicles introduced special abilities that quickly established a clear meta. Chronicle 1 had no such system. Without special abilities, almost every weapon within the same grade had a legitimate purpose, and upgrading your equipment was usually a straightforward increase in power rather than a search for a specific passive effect. The next thing I'd like to talk about is the complete absence of dyes, or tattoos, as we know them today. Back in Chronicle 1, players couldn't visit an NPC to draw symbols that increased one attribute at the expense of another. In fact, if you look at the inventory on the screen, you'll notice that the dye slot simply didn't exist yet. At first glance, this might seem like a minor detail, but it had a much greater impact than many players remember. Choosing a class also meant choosing a race. Every race came with its own unique base statistics, and unlike later chronicles, there was no way to customize them. As you can see in the tables on the screen, each race offered a different balance of strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wit, and mentality. Dark Elf fighters, for example, possessed the highest strength, while Dark Elf mages had the highest intelligence. This made them exceptionally offensive characters, but that power came at a cost. Their constitution was among the lowest in the game, leaving them with less health and reduced resistance to stuns, poison. The same philosophy applied across every race. Perhaps you wanted the tremendous constitution of an orc fighter. In exchange, you sacrificed dexterity. Or maybe you preferred the resilience of a dwarf, accepting lower strength and slower attacks in return. Those weren't decisions that could be corrected later with dice. They were permanent characteristics of the race you had chosen. In Chronicle 1, players didn't simply choose a class. They chose an identity. Another feature that hadn't yet been introduced was the macro system. For some players this made very little difference, while for others it completely changed the way the game was played. There were no automated command sequences, no one-button combinations, and no quality-of-life shortcuts. Everything had to be performed manually. The same was true for soul shots and spirit shots. There was no auto-use function. Every soul shot or spirit shot had to be activated manually before each attack or spell. If you wanted to cast a spell with a blessed spirit shot, you first had to press the spirit shot, and only then cast the spell itself. It was a small action, repeated thousands upon thousands of times throughout a character's journey. Interestingly, many of the very first weapons couldn't use soul shots at all. Players familiar with Interlude may remember beginner weapons consuming 1 or 2 soul shots, but that wasn't the case in Chronicle 1. As you can see from the original shop window, the earliest weapons simply didn't support them. Soul shots existed, but they weren't nearly as universal as they would become in later chronicles. They were expensive, valuable resources, and many players reserved them for dangerous situations rather than using. Or at least, that was the case in the earlier stage of the game. If you used soul shots, you accepted low incomes. Another detail that's often forgotten concerns B-grade armors. Although B-grade equipment already existed in Chronicle 1, its famous set bonuses did not. Those were introduced later, in Chronicle 2. This meant that sets such as Avedon or Blue Wolf provided only their base statistics and defensive values. Wizards couldn't rely on Avedon's casting speed bonus, while heavy armor users couldn't benefit from Blue Wolf's additional strength, movement speed, or health regeneration. For many players today, those bonuses feel inseparable from the armor itself. The next section contains a series of facts that I consider some of the defining characteristics of Chronicle 1. Many of them will appear again throughout the class videos, where I'll explain them in much greater detail, but I wanted to introduce them here first because they influenced virtually every player, regardless of the class they chose. Before we begin, there's one detail you may have already noticed. As you can see on the right side of the screen, there is no combat point or CP bar. Characters only had health points and mana points. Every point of damage went directly to your health, making every fight considerably more dangerous. I'll return to this mechanic later, particularly when discussing the Overlord, but it's important to mention it now because it fundamentally changed the pace of PvP. The first major mechanic is the absence of clear mind. In Chronicle 1, players couldn't simply walk around while regenerating mana at an accelerated rate. Recovering MP usually meant sitting on the ground and waiting. As a result, downtime became a natural. Oddly enough, this also encouraged players to socialize. Instead of rushing from one monster to the next, parties often spent those quiet moments talking while their health and mana slowly recovered. There were also no acumen potions in the shop. This made classes such as the Orc Shaman and the Cleric exceptionally valuable. They were among the very few characters capable of providing acumen, making them highly desirable in mage parties. Interestingly, not everyone agreed that acumen was worth sacrificing another damage dealer. Some groups preferred maximum casting speed, while others simply brought another mage and accepted the slower pace. Even party composition reflected different philosophies of play. Another defining feature of Chronicle 1 was the complete absence of vampiric rage. When most players think back to classic Lineage 2, they often picture destroyers farming catacombs while constantly healing themselves through vampiric rage. That image belongs to later chronicles. In Chronicle 1, fighters had no such luxury. Recovering health meant relying on healers, potions, or simply sitting down to regenerate. Sustaining yourself through endless combat wasn't yet possible. Buff management was also very different. The game allowed a maximum of 20 buff slots, and those slots weren't reserved exclusively for buffs. Buffs, debuffs, and temporary effects all shared the same limit. I'll show a clip from Focus D channel demonstrating this mechanic. As you'll see, a player with 20 active buffs drinks a potion, immediately loses one of those buffs. Today, buffs and debuffs occupy separate interfaces. One of the most notorious skills of the era was Cancel. Unlike the version most players remember from later chronicles, Cancel removed every active buff from its target with a 100% success rate. Against a Spellzinger, that could decide an entire fight before it had properly begun. Imagine finally receiving a full set of buffs from a Prophet and a Shillian Elder before heading to your favorite hunting spot. Then another player challenges you for that location. The Spellzinger casts Cancel. Every buff disappears instantly, and suddenly you're fighting without any of the advantages. It was one of the most feared skills in Chronicle 1. Finally, there's one small detail that many veterans have completely forgotten. The world map wasn't available by default. When you created a new character, you didn't immediately receive a map of Aiden. In fact, your very first quest wasn't about obtaining soul shots, as many players remember from later chronicles. Instead, you were asked to hunt 4 Celtiers, collect their fangs, and exchange them for a map. There were actually 2 separate maps, one covering Aiden, and another covering Elmore, where the orc and dwarf starting villages were located. Later chronicles simply included the map from the beginning. Chronicle 1 expected you to earn it. These are only some of the mechanics that made Chronicle 1 feel so different from the versions of Lineage 2 that most players remember today. There are many more, and we'll encounter them again throughout this. And, to not forget, just to barely scratch the surface, I will also mention the fact that certain debuffs such as Slow or Paralyze had a 2-minute duration. And the notorious and popular fact that, upon being last hit by a mob, you could drop a certain item you wore, but more about that in the videos to come. And with that, we come to the end of this introduction to Lineage 2, Chronicle 1. Over the coming videos, we'll take a historical look at every class in Chronicle 1 as it existed in 2004. We'll examine their strengths, weaknesses, unique mechanics, their role in parties, PvP, and the economy, as well as how they gradually evolved throughout the early chronicles. My goal isn't to tell you which class was the strongest, or to convince you that Chronicle 1 was better than what came after. It's simply to preserve a fascinating piece of gaming history as accurately as possible. If there's a particular class you'd like me to cover first, or a specific mechanic you'd like to see explored in greater detail, let me know in the comments. I'll be reading them all, and they'll help decide what comes next. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next chapter.